Great, sounds good. Wish I could be there with you guys today. You know, been at many of these and missed all those lunches and stuff. So, and Eugene, how fun would that be? Especially taking the train. That was the other idea I had. But anyway, I'm here today remotely as usual in the last couple years, and a lot of you, as Chris is saying, are definitely kind of been involved in our process here. So this will be familiar to many of you. You're probably also familiar with the hiccup that's been happening with whether this rule is, you know, mandatory, voluntary. It's been moving around in the courts and so forth. So we'll address that at the end, but a little spoiler that there is, you know, some movement on that front that we're still actually trying to figure out because it's still moving. Natalie's here because she's doing the actual reporting on this. I'm here to kind of jump in with Climate Office to, you know, sort of help set the stage and our first time out doing this and what sources of data and all that and coordinate that. But the idea with Natalie was to do that. So she will talk about some of the calculations that she actually performed as we go through this. All right, next slide, Natalie, thanks. Okay, so let me pin this. For some reason, I'm seeing not seeing my slide as easily. So let me see if I can pin the right. There we go. Okay. All right. So yes, back in December, we got word that this greenhouse gas measure was going to come online. And this is one more measure in the group of measures that the federal government was FHWA was requiring on sort of strings to our funding from them. So a series of transportation performance measures, congestion measures, and so forth, GHG was being added to that. Came out in the CFR register in January, and we had this quick turnaround that we were supposed to, at the state level, apply this in February. And then 6 months later at the MPOs would also do the same effort. So what is the effort? The idea was that, yes, we want to track greenhouse gas metrics. So the metric there is tailpipe. So we talked about tailpipe, and EVs are free, and then you might grab those if you go to life cycle, but this is tailpipe CO2 emissions on the national highway system. So that's the sort of narrow authority they were using on that sense. So that's the metric. They really wanted us to set some targets. So then they had to have this percent change, the measure being the percent change compared to a baseline, which they chose as year 2022. And then that target, the only kind of requirement they put on it was that it would be declining. And then like all the other TPMs in this set, they'd be these for these performance periods, 2 years and 4 years. And so for this first round, it was this 4 year. And then again, just making sure that applicability, they needed us to shrink down to the national highway system. We'll talk a little bit more about that. The other key thing there was that there were no specific penalties if you did not achieve these targets. So they just wanted us to start tracking these. And then if you didn't achieve it, you just have to sort of explain, you know, why and what you might do next period to make up for that. And the idea was that we would do this for a set, and then we'd come back in October of 2026, and we would have calendar year 2025 that we could say, did we achieve that target? Then go through the process again of setting new targets and so forth, just like all the other performance measures. Next slide. And so this applied to both the DOT and the metropolitan areas. And as I mentioned, DOT had to go first here. And so this has already been submitted. It's really kind of middle school math here for the DOT version. We have 3 things circled there that you use in your calculation. Fuel consumed is gallons we're already reporting as the DOT to FHWA. Multiply by emissions factors that are just tailpipe for the fuel mix nationally that was given to us by the FHWA. So that would give you your total statewide emissions. And then you're just taking the share on the NHS and using the VMT that we already report for HPMS, the Highway Performance Management work. So simple math, you could see there calendar 2022, there's our statewide GHG 17.5, and then the NHS. We actually voluntarily reported for calendar year 2021 as well. Anyway, so that's the reporting on what you observed really based on the gallons of fuels that are sold, both gasoline and diesel. Next slide. So the real trick here with the DOT, since that is not very challenging to calculate, is to set a target. And a lot of states were just setting their legislative greenhouse gas reduction goals, which we do have, but we know that we've gone a little bit further and have some other things. We have revenue forecasts that are out there that have to predict, at least on the light duty side, as to what how many gallons would be sold, because that would gas tax is based on gallons at this point, so that would affect the revenues. Highway cost allocation can get to those sort of heavier vehicles and an estimate of their diesel sales. So with that, we could get one source, but really we wanted to go to our Oregon Transportation Emissions website that is reporting on emissions. And we wanted to say, hey, we're supposed to, and that's that chart over to the right, is we're supposed to get to that vision, the statewide strategy in gold. We're not quite there. 5 years ago, we were on that dash line. Now we're on the solid line. So what we're trying to report here is something that's consistent with where that Plans and Trends 2022 solid blue line is. Jumping to the left-hand side, this would be reporting. We reported in that 2021 year in blue, and then now we had reported on calendar year 2022 in white. And so we're figuring out with the stuff on the right and these forecasts where we want to fall in there. And so, as I said, we chose this Plans and Trends 2022 change in gas sales out of that model to set that target. That target is in that teal blue there, minus 5.8% over that time period from calendar year 22 to 25, which would lead us to that 16.5 million metric tons statewide. So that was done and reported in February. And so then we were moving on to share that with our MPO partners, and we've had a couple meetings and say, okay, 6 months from now, you guys will need to report. So that's, I think, the next slide. And there were some options here because we know gas sales is a little bit more fluid. You can buy gas in one, metropolitan area and drive to another pretty easily. Driving out of the state is a little harder, so it's a better measure at the state level, not as good at the metropolitan level. So they gave some options, and really, the first one is really easy. We've already calculated the state's GHG. If we take the MPO's share of vehicle miles within the state, we can apply that share to the state's GHG reporting. Secondly, another option would be to estimate it based on vehicle miles traveled. So we know HPMS reports, so we're trying to get to some more observed levels. So HPMS reports VMT that has occurred on the roadway, and we can apply the MOVE's emission factors. So those are starting to get back to what James talked about this morning, emission factors. And we had to make some assumptions on speed there. So those are really the two options. We're not really exercising 3 and 4. When we get to the target side, so that was just reporting what's that metric, then you're saying, where will we be in a few years? The easy option they give you is just go with the state's target, as long as you agree to plan and program your projects and show how they're contributing toward accomplishment of that state goal. Secondly, develop your own quantifiable target for your metropolitan area. And so we did work through some of these calculations recently, and Natalie will report on those. So that ends up becoming this 4x4 matrix. Each MPO, are you going with option A, B, C, or D, as we line up, the 2 metric options and the 2 target options. A being the easiest, and then, getting more difficult as we move along. And Natalie will tell you more about these different options, basically.
Okay, so I'm going to go over the metric 1 and metric 2. So that's in the chart on the table on the left. They are pretty similar. The difference is in that last column, and the greatest difference was for Portland and Corvallis and Walla Walla. The smaller MPOs, that difference is probably based on how small the emissions are. And for Portland, it's probably related to the additional inputs that we used with breaking down by vehicle type and emission rates.
And Natalie, before we leave the slide, sorry.
Oh, I wasn't leaving the slide. So metric one, you take the state's CO2 emissions on the NHS and just multiply it by the VMT for each MPO over the VMT for the statewide NHS. For metric two, we break down the VMT by light duty, medium, and heavy, and that was done using HPMS data. For the emission rates, we actually kept it simple, and I had existing emissions for Multnomah County with the EPA MOVES model that James talked about. And I was using the version 3. There's now a version 4 out. And for the NHS, we used 45 miles per hour. TPOW did run all the MPOs on the NHS, and 45 was a reasonable number. Tara, did you have?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, because Peter had a comment this morning about how the emission rates, so this is where they are looking similar, but this is only calendar year 2022, so a historic average. And we're basically saying metric one that was derived based on gallons looks pretty similar to metric two that was derived based on VMT and moves. And the moves here, as I think you'll note in the next slide, does account for the percent EV in calendar year 2022.
In a couple of slides, yeah.
Okay.
So that was looking at the metric 1 and 2 from that block chart. And Tara just presented on this slide, but this is target 1 option, which is for the MPOs to take on the state's target, which was a 5.8% reduction from years 2022 to 2025. So for option number 2 for targets would be, we calculated an examples MPO, and we used Corvallis. TPOW calculated or interpolated from the base year 2019 and future year 2040 of the RTP model. The VMT for year 2022 and 2025, and broke out the VMT by speed bins. So there's 16 speed bins in moves. They're basically 5 miles per hour apart. And the speed bins are shown on the graph on the right. And the emission rates are for light duty, blue, medium duty, orange, and heavy duty is gray. So they start really high at low speeds, and they go down, and then they slightly come back up for higher speeds.
If I could chime in a little bit there.
Oh, right.
So I think at the bottom there, where we're getting this output from the travel model of VMT by speed bins by vehicle type, that's that link back to what James was talking about this morning. The other thing I wanted to point out here is the sort of challenge we realized when we started to look into this is that, you know, you do have to interpolate, right? Your RTP typically has a base year like 2019 and goes out to one future year. So you just only have those 2 points to interpolate. And in reality, you might have a project that comes online in 2023, but we're not being able to make that distinction in here because of that interpolation. So it was really helpful for us to work through these issues, you know, really how we would do them to sort of understand the sort of strengths and weaknesses of the options and what what they really reflect. And I guess the other thing I would mention is the chart on the right. I think right now those are calendar year 2022 CO2 emissions, but I think there'd be like a dash set of lines that would be lower that would represent the 2025 if we had put those in. So I think there is a difference in those emission rates because the EV share in particular is one of the key drivers of that. And we are reflecting that in the calculations that Natalie is doing.
Okay, so this slide goes through the inputs and moves, which should just be a refresher because James went through it earlier today. So for the Corvallis run, I used the moves model, which has more correct data based on the changes to the regulations. And moves is updated every 3 years. as DEQ submits to EPA, our emissions inventory. The things in moves that can change and improve the emission rates are the vehicle age distribution, the different types of vehicles. There's 13 vehicle types and different fuel types, and then the population. So that's the annual vehicle registration population, how many are light duty versus all the 13 categories. And then the vehicle mix varies by road type. And there's 4 road types. You got highway and arterial in an urban setting, and then highway and arterial in a rural setting. And speed distribution is those 16 speed bins. You're looking at how much time in each speed in an hour is spent in each of those speed bins. And then we've got the associated VMT forecasts, which are also put into moves. So out of moves for this example are emission rates. And so if you jump down to the green writing, what we did was to calculate the total emissions is we took the percent of EV VMT and just call that 0. And then we took the rest of the VMT broken down by the 3 vehicle categories and multiplied them by all of those 16 speed bins. And here's the outcome. The table on the left is looking at the change in VMT between 2022 and 2025. And then the table on the right is the emissions. So this exercise showed that the VMT is going up by 3% both in the entire MPO, and if you're looking just at the NHS, it's 2.9, close enough to 3. And then the emissions are dropping by 7%. And this is by just doing what is in the plan and using our interpolated VMTs, this is what will happen. So the assumptions are light duty are all gas, which we know isn't correct, medium and heavy or diesel. So we use the diesel emission factors. This use moves. We had the HPMS to break down the vehicle type. And the speed came from TPOW's COM model. We ran moves in Douglas County, which, if you remember from James's map, for now the moves 4 is assigning counties that they aren't necessarily located in, but have similar features. So it's representative. And then for the EVs, based on the vision model, for 2022, we had 1% EV for light vehicles, and in 2025, we assume that becomes 3%, and 1% for medium and heavy trucks in 2025. And that's not looking at sales, that's looking at the stock. That's all for me. I'll turn it back to Tara.
Great, and a shout out to Nick Meltzer for volunteering Corvallis to let us work through those examples. And I think that's a really good example of what those rates that we're talking about that James could do. So we're doing this in the context of this role, but it is something that now we can do sort of, model requests and do that sort of thing on travel models and, TSPs, RTPs, that kind of thing. So right now it's probably still a sort of spoon feeding a little bit by Natalie and potentially, TPOW if that's the model you're using. But I think we can get to that. All right, so I don't mean this to be animated, so let's move through this. The last thing is on the targets, if you need to, if you're adopting the state target or even if you're doing your own, you need to somehow show that you're, working towards that target. So that, this slide is indicating, hey, we're kind of doing similar things, tracking to that on the CFEC work. And so in particular, what's in yellow there is that CFEC is setting a local 2050 path for all of the 8 metropolitan areas to reach the greenhouse gas targets that are rolled up into the STS. So we're all nested in this thing, and set performance measures to track to that path. So by saying you're on that path through some of the CFEC work, we can also be, saying that we're on the path to the federal greenhouse gas targets. So next slide. So this is where we're kind of comparing those things side by side because they're not exactly the same. The state rules on the left are applied to jurisdictions within the metropolitan areas. On the right, it's the MPOs proper. On the left, it's this performance measure to a path. On the right, we have these particular measures and a target that you're setting that you need to show progress towards. The target itself on the left numerically is in this household-based VMT per capita that Zachary mentioned, a little bit different than on-road. And then on the right, it's more on-road tailpipe. So it's not life cycle, it's just tailpipe, and it's on the NHS, that subset of, but it is all vehicles, where on the left it's light duty. So they're not the same metric by far, and then the reporting cycle, we are doing some foundational work to sort of set up some of the targets that will be tracked right now, and those will go through being updated in the TSPs and reported narratively annually, but then with each RTP cycle, these jurisdictions need to do a major report. And so we're like, in that combination of that major report, could that be pulled into the RTP, which, on the federal rules would need to report in the RTP their progress towards, that federal target. So that was the idea, is that, and I think we're trying to do this anyway, making this easy, because it is, the STS has set these targets for the metropolitan areas, which are at a region level. So it makes sense that it would be reported in the RTP by the metropolitan area at a regional level, as opposed to the individual jurisdictions, which is what we have on the left. So we're trying to make this the easy path and satisfy those two together. So next slide. So we were getting down to the point of like, okay, we need, metropolitan areas need to go talk to all their electeds through these policy boards and so forth, and kind of dialed in on, which choice they were making, A, B, C, or D. If they chose kind of column A, the target, there'd be more that, or less work for the metropolitan region, that ODOT does more of that calculation. Pretty much we've already calculated A and B, so no big deal. If they're sorry, A was done, and B, right. C would involve more. That was the Corvallis example. And if a metropolitan area chose to do anything in column 2 with their own quantified target, there would be more onus on them to calculate and report that. So we were getting to this point, and then next slide. On March 27th, a court case came out and said that, put a pause on this whole thing. Vacated and remanded that greenhouse gas performance measure. There was a second court case as well. And so we were in this, when we initially heard about this and go, gosh, this is just one more chapter in this greenhouse gas target. It originally came out in the Obama administration, was pulled back by the Trump administration, came out, last December. And so we just sort of thought this was another bump in the road and we'd get through it. As we're hearing, there might be some conversations even at the US House and Senate level. So anyway, we're working on this, but our initial reaction was to, as we state there in black, to show support for the measure. You don't really manage what you don't measure. So, and I think it's a really good complement to the forward-looking rules that we have. A lot of our targets are, will we get there? And it's not so much what is our progress? What changes have we made to date, and has it moved the needle? So there's less of that backward looking, and we've been somewhat criticized for that. So I think having more of that. We do have the statewide multi-sector greenhouse gas. So we know transportation in general on an annual basis through some DEQ work, but that has aviation, pulled in with ports, pulled in with these on-road. So nonetheless, I'm just saying, I think it's a very good complement to what we've done. And so I'd like to see it in there, but I know we're sort of in this space now that we're trying to figure out what's the best way to go, both for the state, which we've already submitted and won't pull that back, but in terms of the metropolitan areas. And I think there are options for us to just do this at a statewide level, since we've already calculated some of those metrics as well, that we could just start sharing those on an annual basis. So still trying to figure out what that looks like. And so I'll just stop there with what our status is at this point. And welcome questions.
Yes, thank you all. And yes, definitely would like still have time for questions. So yeah, I'll pause here to see if there's anyone that did have questions or comments.
Yeah,
Peter had one. Yeah.
yeah, thank you, Tara and Natalie. This is the second time I've seen this presentation, and I actually learn more every time I see it. Could we go back to the slide that shows the results of the method B for column where you use the moves and the post-process with the EV percentage? Forward one more slide, or I'm sorry, the other direction. So it shows like the 2022 versus 2025. So this is something that definitely like piques my interest. So here we see an increase in VMT, but a reduction from 2022 to 2025, but a reduction in GHG or emissions. Because I assume the EV assumption, the fleet mix went up from 1% EV to 3% EV. So I assume that's correct.
It's part of it.
Okay, well, I guess that's my question is there any way to break out what's driving that percent decrease in GHG emissions? Because if it truly is the fleet assumption, if it is the increase from 1% to 3% EVs, and that's actually driving a decrease in greenhouse gases, even though VMT is increasing, what are the policy implications of something like that, particularly as it applies to like a local jurisdiction for CFEC or CFA, where the whole goal is greenhouse gas reduction, but we see here that it's not necessarily tied to VMT. It's tied more to fuel consumption.
So I think what's not observed here is that the Corvallis area has a reduction in VMT per capita, but it does not have a reduction in VMT absolute. So they are slowing the growth of VMT, which is helping the greenhouse gas. Even our STS doesn't say we're going to have absolute reductions in VMT in the future. We are going to have reductions in VMT per capita to slow the VMT growth. And then you're going to couple that with cleaning up the miles that do remain. So it's that combination, and you're not, I mean, the VMT per capita improvement is not shown in this slide, right? Because I don't know that we know the population. I guess we could go back to the model and pull that out. That might be a good third chart on here to break out what you're saying. The other dimension that's not shown, and I don't even know if this changed because we haven't looked at it, is it's very sensitive to speeds, and it's very sensitive to like trucks versus light duty VMT. So if we were able to reduce the light duty VMT and not the trucks are dirtier, right? So there's this dynamic of which ones are reducing per capita. So there's that dimension. And then the speeds, if there was cleanup in, some bottlenecks that maybe improve the speeds to more ideal levels. So those are the factors that go into it. You can kind of name them. Reduce the VMT, particularly reduce the heavy duty trucks that are 3 times the emission rates of regular passengers.
The EV was just a couple of the percent points. The vehicle turnover had an impact too.
Yeah,
right. So
yeah,
even just getting newer vehicles in the fleet, the feds show that newer vehicles right through federal CAFE standards are improving that too. So there's a number of dynamics here, Peter, that you're not seeing all of those.
Absolutely. I get that. I guess what I'm hoping for is that we could somehow break out what the impact is of each one of those to see where we're getting the most bang for the buck. Like, how much is VMT per capita decrease contributing to the decrease in GHG? How much is the the fleet turnover? How much is the switch to EV? I just think that would be very informative for our policymakers if they could see exactly what is driving that GHG reduction.
Yeah, that's a really great idea.
Change in 3 years.
Yeah, it's a big change.
Yeah.
Tara,
What
did
is a
this,
big change?
did this
Sorry, I missed
usually
that.
adopt?
Well, we were saying just particularly because that's a big change in just 3 years.
The 7%.
Yeah.
Did this use the adopted RTP scenario?
I'm pretty sure, Alex.
Yeah, I whispered, I think so to Nick. I think so.
Yeah, so and just from the MPO's perspective, so we just adopted an RTP that we did scenario planning for the future year, and the scenario that the policy board shows was a pretty big reduction or a pretty big increase in transit and bike usage. So I think our bike mode splits in the future year were like close to double digits, and the transit mode I think doubled as well. So we're into the teens, I think maybe for both of those. And so we showed a VMT per capita reduction over the next 20 years to start with.
No, it's supposed to be 35, isn't it? Or is it only 25?
It's 25 because that's the target. It's just a 3 year.
Yeah.
It's 2022.
Yeah.
We don't have a model. It's 2025. That was that linear interpolation,
Okay. Oh.
which is a 3 year hop.
And so that's what I'm curious too, is how much are we seeing from 22 to 43
Yeah.
versus 22 to 25?
Yeah, so maybe it's the latter years where we're seeing a more
Right.
increase into the front years that are seeing interpolations.
But I mean, if you got a 7% reduction in 3 years, that's way on trend. Like that's really good.
Great.
I think from remembering the RTP, I think the population was expected to age in Corvallis too, so
Yeah.
fewer workers.
And it would just be useful to know like what's driving that. Is it the EV? Is it the cafe standards? Is it the reduced? I know it's all of those things,
Yeah.
but like what percentage? How much is each one of those driving that?
And I think we're gonna get cut off here, but I did just want to add, so because we have that RTP with the adopted scenario to reduce VMT, we talked about, it's no longer required, but it's optional for MPOs. And so we're gonna bring that conversation to our TAC next week to see what they want to do, because I expect the feds will come back with something else in the future, and it's already in our adopted RTP. So there's kind of a reason to just move forward with maybe a target that's not as strict, or but it'll be really interesting to see where our conversation goes. I don't know where it'll land.
Great. We're just here to support the MPOs and what they need to do that. If we want to still submit, we can do that through some kind of the notes section until this all gets sorted out at the federal level as to what they want. And I think we're toying with ideas of maybe just keeping that, because we would only even report that every 4 years, right? Like we could do it more annually. This isn't a complex calculation that we've done. When you take out the targets in particular, it's not a very complex conversation, so we could post it on the website. So just debating these things and certainly listening to, what the conversations that are happening around the tables that Nick's mentioning.